all you heroes, hawks, heralds, crows, pirates, and wardens. Welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we unpack, discuss, and galaxy brain about all the lore behind the Dragon Age series.
We are so excited to bring you this podcast. Every episode, we'll be talking about a different topic in the Dragon Age universe, from character deep dives to exalted marches and elven gods. We will cover it all.
There will be spoilers. And always remember, swooping is bad.
Hello and welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we talk about Dragon Age and its lore. I am one of your hosts, Austin, also known as Teacup, and I'm here with my other host.
That's me, Shelby, or Shecup.
Yeah, and so we're here to continue our series on the books, and today we are talking about The Calling, written by David Gaider.
Yes, we are. And like last week's episode, this one was also published as a prequel to Origins, and it was published in 2009. But I should say, if you're just tuning in and you missed last week's episode, go and listen to that one first. Or if you're reading the books along with us, go read Stolen Throne first, because this book contains a lot of references to Stolen Throne, and you'll miss out on a lot of context if you read The Calling before the Stolen Throne. So just an FYI there. And the only other little piece of information I have before we dive into the plot is this book is interesting because each chapter, of which there are 19 plus the epilogue, each chapter begins with a verse from the Chant of Light. And there's only one chapter in the entire novel that begins with a dissonant chapter. There are dissonant chapters and verses of the Chant of Light, which is basically like, okay, it's been struck from the canon. Whereas like similarly to our world, there are books of the Bible that were struck from the canon or almost struck from the canon. And so we don't like hold them as part of the Bible anymore. Same situation here. But I think that the kind of intro for each chapter is just like it goes along with whatever the chapter is talking about. The dissonant part doesn't really play anything into the plot. I was totally expecting like, okay, once we reach a certain point where we're finding out the architect's plan, then all of the verses are going to be dissonant. But that is not the case.
That is really interesting.
All right, well, let's just dive right into chapter 1 in the plot overview.
All right.
So chapter 1 opens with the group of Grey Wardens who are comprised by Genevieve, Kel, Hafter, the Mabari, Julian, Nicholas, Fiona, and Duncan arriving at Denerim to approach King Merrick and Terran Logain to ask for help in rescuing Commander Genevieve's brother Bregan from the clutches of the Darkspawn. Logain basically laughs them out of the building, but at the very end, Merrick sneaks out of the palace and joins them without telling anyone. Thoughts?
Well, my first thought is just that we have, from the get-go, we're saying, okay, Logain and Merrick's relationship has not changed that much, especially from the point of when they're asking him if Logain will go, and he's like, no, and then Merrick's like, I'll go, and Logain's response is, what did you say? Like, who talks to their king that way?
Yeah, the one thing that I really wanted to talk about with this chapter is this exact thing, because we spent a lot of time in the last episode discussing, does Logain ever see Merrick as a capable and competent ruler? And ultimately, we came to the conclusion that no, he doesn't. And this chapter is proving that point, especially on page 26, where Merrick is like, okay, yeah, I'll go with you. And it says, you'll do no such thing. Logain lost his composure completely. Duncan almost thought the man might draw his sword on his own king. Things worked very differently in Ferelden after all, end quote.
Yeah, I really think about that. And I talked about the last episode that Logain is loyal to three things, which is Ferelden, Merrick, and Rowan. And not in that order. Logain's loyalty is to his own survival.
which goes along with being loyal to Ferelden for sure. So this chapter ends with Merrick basically saying, okay, yeah, you're right. We're not going to help you. Okay, bye, Logain. And then the night falls, and Merrick sneaks out of his own castle and goes and joins up with them. And that's the end of the chapter. So chapter 2 opens completely different storyline with the POV of Genevieve's brother Bregan, who they are searching for, and he's in the deep roads in a cell surrounded by darkspawn, and then he meets the architect and begins to get the beginning of the architect's plan to basically end the blights, find a middle path between the humans and the darkspawn by making all humans into ghouls.
In this chapter, we just think the architect is an emissary who can talk, which is what Brigand thinks. And then I just think it's interesting to, instead of like entering into this villain who is, oh, let's destroy the world because I am evil and I want to destroy the world, ha. It's like, no, I'm trying to do good here. You just start getting in my way.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I mean, the book really does try to paint the architect as a sympathetic villain. I mean, on page 41, it says the creature nodded, seemingly sympathetic to his plight. Bregan was having difficulty resolving the fact that civilized behavior was coming from such a monstrous being. And so it's very much setting the stage for the architect is not. He is not the same kind of villain as Megran and Severin were in the last book. So in chapter 3, this one we go back to the Grey Warden gang. That's what I'm going to call them throughout this episode. But they're basically traveling across Lake Calenhad. We pick up, well, they're in a boat, and they're going to Kinloch Hold, the Circle Tower, to meet with the mages before setting off to the Deep Roads. Merrick is deeply depressed. Genevieve is like unyielding to her crew. Duncan stays confused, and Fiona hates Merrick. And so they're not getting along whatsoever here. And when they do get to the circle, they are given potions for Merrick to prevent him from getting corrupted, and special brooches to prevent the darkspawn from sensing them, which will become important later. And then Duncan also sneaks out of the ceremony, steals a dagger from First Enchanter Ramil, and bones a mage who tastes like strawberries.
That is the most like chaotic rogue behavior I have ever heard in my entire life.
I mean, fair, but it's what he does. It's just also very, I don't want to say childish, but like very adolescent behavior.
Yes, very like I don't want to sit through this boring ceremony, so I'm gonna go sneak off and do my own thing. I think another important thing here that we didn't talk about because we meet Enchanter Ramil in chapter 1, but he's also Orlesian, and all of these Grey Wardens are Orlesian, which is why Logain is like, burn them all.
Yes, and I mean, in a way, they are Orlesian. Like, Fiona is Elven, first and foremost. Duncan is Ferelden on his father's side, which we learn later in the book. And Utha is Dwarven. So they do all have connections to the Order of Grey Wardens coming out of Orlais. But I wouldn't say personally that they're all Orlesians. However, for Logain, it doesn't really matter, these distinctions. But one thing that I wanted to bring up about this chapter is actually two things. It says about Merrick, it says he had been quiet since they left the city, mostly keeping to himself and asking very little of his appointed keeper, something Duncan heartily approved of. Once or twice, the king had asked some probing questions about the Grey Wardens, questions Duncan had warily answered. And I just bring this up because this illustrates the depth of, I don't even know, it's not character development, but the depth of how far Duncan or how far Merrick has strayed from who he was in the Stolen Throne. It literally, the first thing, he had been quiet. Stolen Throne Merrick, there's no silence. Like, even in the Stolen Throne, Duncan talks about how Merrick is always, quote, babbling. So first and foremost, it's like, okay, this is a different man. We are seeing a different Merrick than we last saw. That's significant. And then the second thing also kind of involves Merrick. I think it's from Duncan's POV. It says, it was proving difficult to reconcile Merrick the Savior, the man who, according to everyone, had single handedly wrested his nation back from the Orlesians and then set about rebuilding it into a force to be reckoned with the sad fellow that sat across from him. Maybe he shouldn't have mentioned anything about a throne. Maybe thrones were bad. And it's just very much establishing Merrick's character at the beginning of this book as a deeply, severely depressed man.
Which I think makes sense. Like his relationship with Logain was never the same. Catriel is dead. Rowan is dead. What does he have to be happy
Yeah.
about other than like Kaylin? Like, and I think he does love Kaylin, but I think he doesn't know how to talk to Kaylin.
Well, and Kaylin is so young here. So it's not like they can have adult conversations about how much they miss Rowan and all this kind of
Mhm.
stuff. Like he's a little kid. He is like a kindergartner at this time period. Okay, so in chapter 4, they have left the circle and they are going into the Deep Roads entrance near West Hill, which is where the Battle of West Hill occurred. So Merrick is kind of reminiscing. He is in his feelings a little bit about how terribly that battle went and also about everything that happened afterward. And he starts to get cold feet about joining these Grey Wardens.
And I think that makes sense. I mean, this was not a happy time for him.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do get some kind of reflections on like the fate, on why, how Rowan died. Merrick kind of speculates that it was because she got some form of darkspawn corruption while they were in the Deep Roads. And then lastly, the kind of final thing I wanted to touch on is they have this big argument, actually, all of them, because Merrick is asking questions about like why we think Bregan is captured, all this stuff. And they finally are like, well, Genevieve has been having these visions, and Merrick rightfully is like, hold on, we're following this. We're going into the Deep Roads on a whim, like because of a vision, not because of any hard proof. And obviously they get mad, and Fiona's like, well, we believe our commander, like you don't have to come with us. And so they argue, and finally Genevieve approaches Merrick after he's kind of gone off on his own, and they have a conversation, and he does ultimately decide, fine, okay, I'll go with you.
I just have to pause and read this quote. For me, it's on page 90. I don't know if it's similar for you, but it says, I dreamed after she's talking about dreams. He goes, I dreamed of Logain brought me a barrel of cheese. I opened it and there were mice inside, made of cheese, which we ate while singing sea shanties. Are you saying this had some deeper meaning? He grinned, suddenly amused at the indignant flare in the elf's nostrils. Perhaps my bond with Logain told me that he actually harbors a deep love of cheese. I should have realized it sooner. That is the Merrick we know. Like, so he's still there a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah, well, like we see glimpses of the old Merrick, and I think we see more and more as the book goes on. But in the beginning, at least, the moments are few and far between. So in chapter 5, the Grey Warden gang enters the Deep Roads. Merrick and Fiona continue to snipe at each other, or really, Fiona continues to snipe at Merrick. Julian and Nicholas, they play chess. Genevieve tasks Duncan with the job of making sure that Merrick gets to the surface safely if things devolve, or killing him if Merrick sees too much Grey Warden business.
When we're introduced to the Grey Wardens in Duncan and in Origins, it's like, oh, they're this super cool order. They're kind of like the Jedi, like they're these defenders, like they're cool and they're awesome. And then we meet Grey Wardens in every single other media of Dragon Age. And I am like, I hate all of you.
So you hate the Grey Warden gang.
Just Genevieve. The other ones are fine. Your obsession with stopping the blight. And there's a quote later on. We'll get to that chapter. But it just, and Fiona's like, we have to have such Grey Warden secrets. And so, yeah, let's kill this ruler of Ferelden who graciously let us back into Ferelden and cause a whole nother scene.
Yeah. I mean, and we'll talk about this, I think, when we get to Bregan and Genevieve's character, but I think that they are both of Genevieve and Bregan are so ruled by bitterness that it's hard for them to see the right path. Whereas the rest of them, like literally, I think Duncan would make a better commander than Genevieve. Like, I hate her. I hated her from the get-go. And we were talking about this earlier, but the first time I read this book, like, I didn't like her, but she didn't bother me nearly as much as she bothers me now. And I could not stand her. Like, it was painful to read the chapters with her in it because I hated her so much. And we'll talk about
Mhm.
why in a few chapters. But like, I really loved Kel. I want more of
Mhm.
Kel's story. Like, he was really my favorite character upon rereading this novel. But
Mhm.
let's move on to chapter 6. And we switch back to Bregan's POV in this one. And we learn that when we learn more about his background and his story, and that when he was the commander of the Grey in Orlais just before Genevieve, he was incredibly popular, a man of the people. And Genevieve is not that at all. And we learn that actually Bregan only became a Grey Warden because of his sister Genevieve, because the recruiter would only take her if he went too. And so we get all this backstory, and we learn also that Bregan is hearing the calling of the Darkspawn more clearly and more persistently in the present day, and that he also is beginning to hear more of the architect's plan. Obviously, we knew about the ending of the blights, but the architect also wants to establish this middle way, eternal peace between the darkspawn and humans. And at the end of the chapter, the architect gives Bregan the opportunity to leave and return to the surface, and he doesn't take it. And so for me, the big reflection I have is like this moment where the architect takes Bregan to the surface and is like, okay, like you can go, I won't kill you, is kind of the point of no return for Bregan.
And I think it's like the architect's test to see what's going on. The architect's like, oh, I'm just going to let him go. And if he doesn't go, that means my plan is working.
Absolutely. I think I agree with that. And like the architect says, like, you're not dying, you're changing. And the fact this happens right before they go and do that. And for me, it's like, okay, yes, he may be changing, but by the time he decides to ally with you, he is changed. Like the change has occurred. And then just kind of the last thing I wanted to point out with this chapter is the architect is a really interesting character in this novel because he simultaneously is extremely emotionally intelligent and also completely baffled by humanity. He does not understand and not just humanity, all like non-dark spawn creatures. Like he does not understand a lot of the decisions that we make. And he even says that multiple times to Bregan, but also at the same time he's so observant and he listens to
Mhm.
Bregan and tries to like fit all of this new information into his like cache basically in his mind of like, okay, this is why humans do this, etc. And so I find the architect very interesting. I don't like him, but it's hard for me to completely hate him because he's so different from any other darkspawn we've ever seen.
And I know Will might talk about this later, but like I'm a little confused about the architect and Corypheus and how like they are so different from each other.
Yes. I have that as a lore inconsistency point at the very end of the episode. So we will definitely
Mm.
get there. But let's go on to chapter 7. And this one is not there's not a lot that happens in this one. Basically, the Grey Warden gang is attacked by Darkspawn while they're wandering in the deep roads. They survive with minimal injuries, like they're definitely injured, but no major issues. And Fiona is able to heal them. And so they continue to try to get away from the coming wave of Darkspawn when they make their way into a dragon's nest in the deep roads.
Not a lot because all my comics are in the next chapter.
The next chapter. Me too. Okay. Well, in chapter 8, this is the one where they're fighting the dragon, and many of them are gravely injured in the process. Hafter the Mabari takes a pretty rough beating. They aren't sure he survives, but he did. Kel is taken into the dragon's maw entirely. He gets a bunch of ribs broken. Duncan climbs onto the back of the dragon in order to get to its head and take it down. He slips, is injured while doing this, and Julian pulls him to safety. While Julian is pulling Duncan away, the dragon takes Julian into its maw, and Julian is killed. And then finally, Genevieve is able to take the dragon down, We learn obviously Hafter is okay, like I mentioned earlier, but Julian's not. Julian is dead. And Nicholas, Julian's closest friend, and we find out later, lover, is furious with Duncan and like attacks him, yells at him, screams at him, and they argue. And Duncan runs away. And that's how the chapter ends. And I should
Right.
also say before we get into discussion that this chapter is the one with the dissonant canticle verse.
I just have like several thoughts about this of like most of the dragons that we see, especially in Inquisition, they like these open areas. Like we don't really see dragons inside caves or inside like we see some small dragons inside ruins sometimes. But like most of these dragons are in wide open spaces, yet here is one in the deep roads. How did this dragon get into the deep roads if it wasn't just there all along? Well, I thought they killed dragons, but maybe their dragons hid out in the deep roads.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we know the answer to that question. Because in the chapter they wonder about it too. They're like, how did this get here?
This chapter, we get our first casualty in Julian, and I was very sad for Hafter, but then I was okay. The argument that Duncan has with Nicholas, you can see that like Duncan is like trying to be like understanding, like he's trying to realize like, okay, Nicholas lost his friend, like there's a lot going on here, not being reactive until Nicholas just starts like poking him, and then he has his breakdown with a speech that I think is true but lacks tact.
Mm-hmm.
And I just see that like, okay, Duncan is trying to be mature. Okay, you've pushed him too far. Now he's reverting to his age.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, well, let's move on to the next chapter, which really does also deal with this aftermath of the argument. So, chapter 9, basically, Duncan has ran away, like we just said, but Fiona and Merrick together go to find him. They are getting along a little bit more, and they find Duncan sitting alongside an emerald lake. We learn that Duncan never wanted to be a Grey Warden, and Genevieve conscripted him as a punishment because he murdered her fiance, Guy, who was also a Grey Warden. Fiona and Merrick successfully convince him to return, and when they get back to the group, there's more arguing. Kel argues with Genevieve and says, like, hey, we need to turn around. Like, this is crazy. We can't keep doing this. They all argue, eventually deciding to continue, and they lay Julian to rest in the lake. And so I think the big thing that two big things that I have for this chapter are number one, Merrick commiserates with Duncan and tells him about the first person he ever murdered and how it wrecked him. And like, you can't beat yourself up for everything, like for your whole life. Like Merrick may have changed, but the lessons that he learned in the Stolen Throne stuck with him.
Mhm.
And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is with Duncan and just his character, the man who never wanted to be a Grey Warden, the man who had no interest in this whatsoever, will eventually go on to recruit many Grey Wardens and be a great leader for the Grey Wardens. And I think that that's pretty significant.
I definitely agree with that. It's very interesting that like Duncan was conscripted. Like I found that very interesting.
So in chapter 10, we go back to Bregan's point of view again. And this is where things start to get a little crazy because Bregan wakes up and he feels totally different. The Darkspawn song isn't driving him as mad as it was previously, though the song is stronger, yet easier to ignore. He remembers nothing of his conversations with the architect, but he reminisces on his life with the Grey Wardens, which we learn he hated. Bregan and the architect go on to have a conversation about the changes that are occurring within him. He's got increased hearing, sensitivity to light, physical corruption of his skin. Bregan is horrified, understandably, but the architect claims that he asked for this. And then at the very end of the chapter, we switch back to more Grey Warden gang perspective, and they're just continuing to travel. What are your thoughts about this chapter?
I think we're getting like such different perspectives. I think it's interesting that we get this perspective after this story of like how Duncan never wanted to be a Grey Warden. He never wanted to do that. Like he was conscripted and all that stuff. But we know from the story that he begins to like live into it and believe it and all that stuff. And then we get contrast with Brigand and like, nah, I hated being a Grey Warden. Like, it's terrible.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. And the only thing I really have to say or add about this chapter is the question of, did Brigand really ask for this corruption to be accelerated, or did the architect lie to him? I don't think the book gives us a clear answer. And I don't necessarily know if there is a clear answer on it. But I'm curious what your thoughts would be.
I think the architect is lying. And I think that he did this to Brigand. And it was to convince Brigand of the rightness so that he could convince the others.
I don't know. I don't think that the architect is outright lying intentionally. I think he may have misunderstood Brigand, but I'm not sure he would explicitly lie. Maybe he would. But everything we've seen thus far, he's been pretty open and honest.
But like, is it open and honest, or is it like soulless level open and honest? Like there is intentional misinformation being held here.
I mean, I definitely think he is also doing that for sure. But we could probably go on this subject for probably 20 more minutes, which we don't have time for. So let's go to chapter 11, in which the Grey Warden gang continues making their way through and toward Ortantag. Duncan reveals to Fiona that Genevieve's skin is being affected by the Darkspawn corruption. And all of the Grey Wardens, except for Duncan, are having increasingly worsening dreams. They reach Ortantag. They do not find any blight spiders like in the Stolen Throne, but they do enter into a chamber room with a bunch of dwarven skeletons and a dead dwarven king who is possessed by a demon who then possesses Fiona, becomes an abomination within her, and then puts them all to sleep.
Yeah.
And I will say I don't have much to say about this chapter because all of my reflections are in the next two. So unless you have anything specific to say, I say let's just get on with it.
All right, let's keep going.
All right. So chapter 12 opens with all of them in the Fade, and really not, we don't see all of them. We see them in individual dreams. So we see Merrick first, who's with Catriel. He gets out of his dream first to find the others, and he's motivated by a promise that he made that he would help Fiona. Catriel goes along with Merrick to help him find his way out. Merrick then goes to Duncan's dream, where he is living with his parents who owned a carpentry business. Duncan wakes up when he and Merrick argue, and Duncan's father reminds him that he didn't raise Duncan to be disrespectful. And that's when Duncan says, "You didn't, but you died." And so he wakes up. Merrick and Duncan go to rescue Kel next, who is living as a Jarl of a Avar tribe. He has a wife and he has a kid, but he's pretty easily convinced that it's a dream. They then go to Utha's dream, where she's surrounded by a huge dwarven family. She can talk, where she can't in the book, and she already knows she's in the Fade. She's accepted it already, but she agrees to go back with them to fulfill her vow to avenge her family. And then next, they go to Nicholas's dream, where he and Julian are living in the middle of nowhere in the Arbor Wilds. No one even knows they're there, so Nicholas and Julian are extremely suspicious of them. And Nicholas actually refuses to go back, instead electing to stay with his lover, Julian. And at this point, Merrick is like embarrassed because he's like, "Oh, I called them friends earlier. My bad. Like, I didn't realize they were lovers."
At least he corrected himself. It's interesting because in a lot of ways, this is the plot of the recruitment of the Mage's Quest and Origins. Like, this is pretty similar to that. But I find it interesting that, like, Nicholas, this choice to remain, it's just really interesting to me, especially in the idea of, like, being so overwhelmed with grief that, like, you're willing to stay with a spirit or demon's imitation of this person, just so you don't have to be without them.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's sad, but even Nicholas admits, like, he knows he is not being the bigger person here. He's like, "Look, like, I know." And Duncan even says, like, "No, it's wrong. Like, you can't do this. How can you let the demon defeat you like this?" And it says, Nicholas nodded slowly, closing his eyes as if the idea pained him. "Julian saved you," he sighed. "He did the right thing. I know that. I wish I'd died with him." Then he paused, opening his eyes and looking directly at Duncan. Tears streamed down his cheeks. I did die with him. This has nothing to do with the demon.
It was very sad. Um,
Yeah. And I want to talk more about their relationship at the end of the episode. Um, so I don't want to dwell too long on it, but it is a heartbreaking moment. And I think it's like a reminder that not everything in our life can be solely focused on our partner, on your romantic
mhm.
relationship. You do need to have a life outside of them. So in chapter 13, they continue on trying to wake everybody up. They've gotten everybody except for Genevieve and Fiona. And so they go to rescue Genevieve first. She is the wife of a seneschal, who, of course, is Guy. Duncan is the only one allowed in to see her. They argue. Genevieve is filled with rage, and they then fight with swords. She eventually sees that Duncan's right and leaves. The Grey Warden gang goes then to confront the demon possessing Fiona. Fiona, unlike the rest of the group, is not living out her dearest fantasy, but actually her worst nightmare. She is back living as a slave to Count Dorian, and the demon is torturing her. They fight the demon. Fiona cannot be convinced that it's a dream until the demon almost kills Merrick. And Merrick is able to behead the demon, and they all wake up. So I have lots of thoughts here. I think even though it is a dream, even though we are in a fade and it in the fade and it's extenuating circumstances, I think we really see Genevieve's true nature here because she's cruel to Duncan. She wants to hurt Duncan when Duncan is just trying to get her out of the fade. And she's so cruel to him. It says, "This is a good life," she said, her voice low and filled with steel. Bregan is happy. I am happy. Guy is alive. And most important, I've never had anything to do with the Grey Wardens and especially little bastards like you. Her last words hit hard. He stared at her in disbelief, unable to formulate a response. What did you think? She snapped. That I would recruit the murderer of the man I loved as a reward? It was a punishment. I wanted to be a Grey Warden, but my brother made it a misery. He hated it, and knowing that he joined because of me made me hate it too. You took away the one thing that allowed me to forget. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. She gritted her teeth, the anger making her shake. I was so certain that you would die in the joining, that you would get just a taste of what Guy and the rest of us had to go through. Enough for you to choke on. But you survived, and the Maker played yet one more joke on me.
I think one of my frustrating points with Genevieve is that she's not a good Grey Warden. Like, she's not in this
No.
for the right reason. She's in it really for her own glory and, like, is so angry about what was taken about her that she uses this as a punishment. And I think
Mhm.
that is the first thing of, like, nah, you are not a good person.
Something that maybe will elucidate this point a little bit more for our listeners who haven't read it or maybe disagree with us this far on this point is in this dream, Genevieve's brother, Bregan, is not a Grey Warden. He is a Chevalier. And so that means that Bregan and Genevieve's family come from nobility in Orlais because
Mm-hmm.
you cannot be an Orlesian Chevalier unless you are part of the nobility or unless you lie about your noble upbringing. And so to me, she comes across as a very entitled, very I deserve this. I deserve to be part of the Grey Wardens because of who I am, because I'm such a great warrior. And understanding that she comes from a noble background makes that a little bit more okay. Well, of course, you
Mm-hmm.
would think that if you come from a noble background. And so I think she's probably grew up with a life of privilege and thinks things should be handed to her. And then she didn't make it into the Grey Wardens by herself. And she's bitter and has allowed that bitterness to ruin her whole entire life. All right, so let's go on to the second half of this chapter where they go to rescue Fiona. And the only thing I really have to say about this, we've talked a lot about Fiona's characterization in her character deep dive last season. But the thing that I find so interesting is that Fiona cannot be convinced it is a dream. Like she really is stuck in the trauma of it all. But the thing that brings her out of it is Merrick's impending death. Narratively, it's good writing because it's showing us that there is something more to the relationships between them before they've even made a romantic connection with each other.
I totally agree. Which it is good writing because it sets up and the lore behind this that like not everything in the Fade is a lie. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
the old thing of like, yes, you lose your inhibitions when you're drunk, but most of the time that you're not doing something when you're drunk that you haven't thought about sober.
Drunken words are sober thoughts is a saying for a reason. I mean, it's similar. Chapter 14. Basically, the Grey Wardens, they wake up from the Fade. Genevieve is like frantically pushing them forward. Fiona thanks Duncan for coming to get her, and Duncan's like, "You shouldn't be thanking me. It was Merrick." And she's like, "Wait, what? What?" Eventually, Kel tracks Bregan's scent to a huge cavern. Before they attempt to scale it, Kel confronts Genevieve and is like, "What are we doing? Like, this is not okay." She refuses to listen. She punches him once, gets attacked by Hafter, and then punches Kel again. And the group realizes at this point all of the older Grey Wardens, their skin is significantly corrupted by the Darkspawn taint. And Merrick then tells the group about Flemeth's warning that a blight is coming. They all are dreaming of the archdemon. Fiona, when she wakes up from her nightmare, Merrick wakes up too, and then they bone at the end of the chapter.
Okay, just real quick thing with the last thing. What is Merrick's deal with Bonin in the Deep Roads?
I don't know. I find it disgusting to think about. Like, are you putting your ass on the floor that is filled with dust and darkspawn corruption? Because I can't. I can't. I can't.
But again, like the things that stay out to me is like Merrick's continued obsession with Flemeth's words. Like, I know we don't know exactly what Flemeth has said to him. We know bits and pieces, but they obviously rung true to an extent that like they're really sticking with him. And then we see that the corruption is spreading and it's unclear if that like is because they're in the deep roads or they're just older. But I think one thing that we find out here is that Duncan has nothing. Like, and he is the most recently recruited, but he has nothing.
Right, exactly. And that's significant, and we'll get understanding of why later. But the thing for me that I
Mhm.
want to talk about in this chapter is Genevieve. What I want to talk about with Genevieve is this fight she has with Kel. And this is not the first time she's been physical with one of her subordinates, but like this is the worst, I think, example of it. Like she physically punches Kel and like knocks him on his ass. And the Mabari attacks her. She throws him off and then she goes after Kel again. Like this is not good leadership. Like this is bad. This is really bad. Like this is the hallmark of an abusive leader. Like can you imagine if you're at your job and you express a concern about your plan for work for whatever it is you're doing to your boss and your boss punches you in the face? You would sue them.
Mhm.
You would have a legal lawsuit on your hands and you would win. It says Hafter launches himself at Genevieve and he is like messing her up. And I wrote, when a dog hates you, so do I. That's really all I've got to say about it.
And like we know that Mabari are extremely loyal to their masters. Like, and so obviously when she attacks Kel, like it's all bets off for Hafter. At the beginning, she had their loyalty because she was their commander. But as it becomes increasingly clear that Genevieve does not care for their safety, they all start rebelling and asking questions. And I think this comes down to it. It's like when you ride a horse, if you're unsure of yourself, if you're not leading with confidence, if you're not ensuring or communicating to the horse that you know what you're doing and you're in charge, it doesn't listen to you because it doesn't think you can protect it. And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of what's going on here. Like you can't, they don't think Genevieve can protect them because Genevieve has no interest in protecting them, which is true because Genevieve's goal is not about stopping the blight. It's not about, protecting the knowledge of where the old gods are from the darkspawn. It's about finding Bregan and getting her own satisfaction of that.
Genevieve is concerned with Genevieve, not the Grey Wardens. All right, so let's move on to chapter 15. So in this one, they haven't really come to a conclusion, and so they've decided to break for the night. And Genevieve is on watch. She separates from the group a little bit and sees a darkspawn Herlock approaching her. This Herlock turns out to be Bregan. She goes with him, and the group wakes up to find her gone. Darkspawn are everywhere. They're fighting. And just when it seems like they're going to lose this fight, a huge blast of magic appears and they're all knocked out.
It's Bregan that is, and the architect that is holding off the Darkspawn horde from them. We learn that in this chapter. And we learn that, like, Bregan comes in and he's like, oh, you have to hear this plan, Genevieve. Like, it's a great plan. And we have to do this. And Genevieve's like, okay, like, I'll come with you. And just abandons all of her people, knowing that, okay, it doesn't matter if they all get overrun by the Darkspawn. Like, it is so incredibly stupid. You think that if a bunch of Orlesian, in his mind, Orlesian Grey Wardens take Merrick, for all Loghain knows, kidnapped Merrick into the Deep Roads, the man is going to declare war on Orlais. Like, they ain't going to have to worry about the blight, because Ferelden and Orlais are going to destroy themselves because of your carelessness.
I just couldn't believe Genevieve is approached by this Darkspawn, and she so quickly turns to Bregan's point of view. And I'm like, I really expected you to put up more of a fight than this. Like, this is pathetic, Genevieve. You are sad. But let's take a little bit of a mid-break.
What is this? A new book? All this shit is weird. Oh, Varric, that is a terrible title. What are you even thinking?
That book you were reading this morning, Hessarian's Spear. I don't think he had a spear in the legends.
He does in this one. Read the description.
Andraste knelt before no man but her maker. But she hadn't counted on the Archon Hessarian. Can Hessarian penetrate the tight-knit defenses of the warrior prophetess? Will she be prepared to face the full blast of his power? Wait a minute. Isabella, this is a vulgar thing.
You want to borrow it?
No!
You sure? It has pictures.
Not listening, I'm not listening.
Varric, does Hawke ever autograph books?
Why? Doesn't your copy of The Tale of the Champion have a big hole in it?
Yes, but it could also have Hawke's signature on it.
All right, welcome to the middle of the show where we talk about all the stuff with the podcast, and we take time to thank our patrons. Thank you so much to all of our patrons. Thank you to our first patrons, Lisa M. and Genesis. Thank you to our newest patron, Angel C. Thank you for signing up and joining us on Patreon. You can join us too on patreon.com/DALorecast and sign up there. Come sign up at the first Enchanter tier, and you can come on our monthly patron chats, which is coming up. If you can't do that, another great way to support us is to leave us ratings and reviews. We don't have any to read today, but if you leave us a rating or review with 5 stars and kind words, we will read it out on a future episode of the show. And lastly, I want to tell you about our Discord. This is the place to talk about Dragon Age with us, to come and get your Dragon Age news about the Lorecast first, to come and talk about the latest Dragon Age news. Dragon Age summer is upon us. Any day now, we could get some information about Dragon Age Dreadwolf. And with that, we are aware of some of the rumors that are circulating about DA Dreadwolf rumors. We'll discuss those more in a coming episode. And I think that's all I have for the middle of the show.
All right, well, let's get back into it.
The past years have been so busy. We have earned at least a few moments of rest. A calm night out sounds... Oh, bravo! Bravo! Was the woman in gold playing a king? Who was the man in feathers? Oh, it's all very simple. The first actor's mask is determined by... well, I will lend you the program guide. But tell me, did you enjoy the performance? That was one of the greatest things I've ever seen. Truly. That part with the glittery, and they actually set fire to... Yes, I truly enjoyed it. Then I call tonight a great success.
I've got some of it written down now.
Give it here. Her breasts strained against the leather jerkin like two wild stallions corralled against their will. She pounced, the smooth moves of a jungle cat, and locked her thighs around Donnick's waist. He...
What? Nothing. What is that?
Isabella just thought she'd celebrate your love affair with a written dedication.
It's friend fiction. I do it out of love.
I will never, ever be clean again.
You fear barbarians will swoop down upon you.
Yes, swooping is bad.
So we only have a few more chapters left. In chapter 16, the Grey Wardens, they all wake up in a cell together. The Darkspawn corruption has again increased. The architect, Genevieve, and Bregan all come to them to basically convince them, like, hey, come with us. End the blights with us. Uther is the only one that joins, and they leave the rest of them time to mull it over, during which they plan their escape. I personally don't have a lot to say about this one because I have more to say about the next one. So unless you have anything, we can go on.
Uther joins because I just think Uther is so driven by her promise of vengeance that
Yes.
it's the only thing that motivates her.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And I think it makes sense too. Like, she joined the Silent Sisters to avenge her family, and then she joined the Grey Wardens to avenge them as well. And it's like, yeah, this makes sense.
There is a quote in here before that I think about Genevieve and Bregan and Kell. And it's basically like Genevieve is like, we need to think about how we stop the blight. Like, we have to stop the blight. And Kell responds, our duty is to protect humanity from the blight. And I just think that is such a distinction, and it's so minute and it's so small, but it is the point of like the Grey Wardens forgetting why they were created in the first place. They weren't created to continuously combat the Darkspawn. They were created to be humanity's shield against the Darkspawn, which is why this plan, I think Kell and the others are like, no, we're not getting on board with this plan.
So in chapter 17, Duncan, the thief, of course, is able to break them out of the cell. He finds their weapons easily. He is the one that kind of makes the plan of where they're going to go. Unfortunately, the Darkspawn are everywhere, and so they can't really figure out like which way to go. And so Kell and Hafter draw the Darkspawn's attention away by, going out and attacking them, so that Merrick, Duncan, and Fiona can escape. And so Kell sacrifices himself. He originally wanted Hafter to go with them, but Hafter basically refused, which is so sad. Hafter would not leave his master, and so they both perish, taking down Darkspawn. But eventually Merrick, Duncan, and Fiona are able to come to the same Legion of the Dead outpost that Merrick visited the first time he was in the Deep Roads, and they rest. Fiona and Merrick bone again, and then eventually they find this trail that leads up to a cavern. Fiona blasts it open magically. They are able to get out to the surface when first Enchanter Ramil and two other Orlesian mages approach and take them captive.
Yeah, so it's interesting. First of all, like, so sad with Kell and Hafter, and like when he kicks Hafter and he like gets sad down and everything, and then Kell is all kinds of sad or whatever. It's just like, just let the man and his dog be okay.
I know, I was so sad by that, but I understand it because like I mean, Snips does this thing a lot where we tell her and we tell her and we tell her to go do something and she won't. And you finally are just like, would you please listen to me? And I feel like that's where Kel is when he kicks Hafter, because this is a life or death situation. He doesn't want his dog to die. He wants his dog to go with the others and protect them and escape. But Hafter doesn't want to be separate from his master. And so finally Kel is like, okay, come fight the Darkspawn with me, buddy.
Which is so sad. Favorite character left to die. I just laugh so much at like Logain for having Orlesian paranoia, but every time he's suspected Orlesians, he's been right.
I know. That's fair. Let's get into this circle business. So in chapter 18, they are taken back to the circle, which has been taken over. A coup has been staged by Ramil and his allies. When they arrive, the architect, Genevieve, Utha, and Bregan are all already there. We learn that the architect has manufactured all of this, luring them into the deep roads via Genevieve's visions and the black brooches he was able to track them with. Like, he has manufactured all of it. And finally, his full plan comes out that humanity will live in peace with the Darkspawn by becoming fully tainted. Genevieve was not aware of this part of the plan, and so she's pissed. Ramil is only allying with the architect in order to snare Logain and now Merrick to deliver them to the Orlesian Emperor. They all are arguing, and it's a huge mess. And while this is happening, Merrick, Fiona, and Duncan escape their shackles and begin to attack.
One of my things that really makes me laugh is that Ramil is like, oh, you can't do anything. Oh, it must be the hero River Dane who's coming across the river to attack us. And Merrick's like, well, if Logain's coming, like, you're toast or whatever. And Ramil's like, not while I have his precious king captured. And Merrick's like, you don't know Logain.
Yes, that made me laugh out loud. But another that I thought was just so funny is when they're all arguing about the architect's plan, and Fiona is finally like, why can't you see you're being manipulated? Like, what? And I'm just like, yeah, this is so clearly like you can just see right through this.
Right. And like, it makes me so mad. Just like, here she is. She's like, oh, no, we're not going to be manipulated. We're going to stand against this. But the minute that it's her in those places, she's like, oh, yes, Alexios, like, we'll just do whatever. Yes, we'll be slaves to Teventer.
I don't really think that's fair because, like, nothing's happening. There are no extenuating circumstances that convinces Genevieve and Bregan to ally with the Darkspawn. At least once Genevieve and Bregan have been reunited. There's no extenuating circumstance. However, for Fiona, when she is with Alexius, there is extenuating circumstances because she's in charge of a crap ton of mages who are all relying on her to provide for them. And not only that, but Alexius is interfering with their sense of sanity by using the time magic and making them, basically gaslighting them. So I don't really think that's a fair comparison.
I guess that's true. I take back my criticism then.
Okay. Anyway, so some things I wanted to highlight about this chapter is I think we see the full effect of Bregan and Genevieve's rage and bitterness here, where Genevieve has taken Duncan's daggers and he's like, why would you do this? Like, can you just let it lie, basically? And he refuses to help her, and she's like, you won't help me, you owe me, like, you have to help me. And Duncan is furious. He's like, I think I know why Guy was so relieved when I killed him. It wasn't because he wanted to get away from the Grey Wardens, it was because he was happy to get away from you. And she's furious, and Duncan's like, sorry, but it's true. There's a conversation in the next page talking about Bregan is also bitter, and he wants to kill the mage, he wants to kill the Grey Wardens, he wants to kill Merrick, he wants to kill all the Orlesians, he wants to kill everyone. And so it's interesting to me because Bregan and Genevieve are both violent. They're both motivated by violence, but Genevieve is motivated by bitterness, motivated by her chip on her shoulder, motivated by what she feels like she's owed, whereas Bregan is motivated by complete rage.
I think we see the flaw in like teaching Grey Wardens, especially like you should do anything to stop the blight. And like Fiona, Duncan are so new to Grey Wardens that they haven't had as much indoctrination in there in regards to being a Grey Warden, that they're like, well, no, let's not destroy the world while trying to save it.
So let's get into the fight a little bit. And this happens in chapter 19. So they all begin fighting. We learn that Ramil has access to darkspawn magic as well. Genevieve dies pretty early on. Duncan realizes that the dagger he stole from Ramil can actually repel the darkspawn magic. Duncan then stabs Ramil, and Bregan finishes him off with a decapitation. Logain and his forces then arrive because he had heard that Orlesian mages had taken over the circle. And so Logain is not there to rescue Merrick. He is there to fight Orlesians, as is very typical for Logain. And then at the end of the chapter, Bregan lets the soldiers kill him, and the architect and Utha have disappeared.
I enjoy this kind of writing where something that you think is so insignificant comes in and into play and like is a game changer and explains why Duncan isn't hearing the calling, why he isn't accelerating his corruption. But I do have a question, like, does he keep this? Is this the same dagger that he uses when we see him in Origins?
I think it is.
Oh, that's cool.
Eventually everything ends happily. Well, not happily, but ends nicely with the good guys winning. But the architect does escape. And then, like in The Stolen Throne, the epilogue does not come back to this at all. The epilogue skips to a completely different thing that we haven't yet, that has not been addressed at all so far in the book. And so the epilogue begins with Duncan and Fiona visiting King Merrick in Denerim. Logain is not there. Merrick has sent him back to Gwarin, and Duncan and Fiona reveal that Duncan is being stationed in Ferelden to build up the order as they are now allowed back. Fiona is being relocated to Weishaupt because the taint has been reversed within her, and that Fiona has given birth to a son. So she is leaving him in Merrick's care and wants him to be raised normally, not in the palace, without the burden of the crown and without the burden of the Grey Wardens.
And I think the reason this epilogue does is these are meant to be prequels to the games. And so each epilogue sets up the stage of like the Ferelden we're entering and sets up the stage of like, oh, here's Alistair and here's the story about who his mother is. Even though in game we're like, wait, your mother's, if you read this before the game, you're like, what the hell? Your mother's not Goldana. Your mother is Fiona.
Yeah. And I think there's dialogue in the game that's you can basically be like, Alistair, this is not your mother. And so that makes sense. But the thing that I find so sad about this epilogue is like Fiona's wish that Alistair would not have the burden of the crown or the Grey Wardens. It's like, well, neither of those turned out to be true. If he actually doesn't have the burden of the crown or the Grey Wardens, then he's a drunk in Kirkwall. And that's sad to me. But also just like a thing that frustrates me with stories, like the possibility of them having sex twice in like a 2-day period and her getting pregnant from that is really slim. Like, let's just say that that is very rare. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but that combined with the fact that she is a Grey Warden and likely has a lower ability, a lower chance to get pregnant, and the fact that they have only had sex twice, and the fact that like she's not on any prenatal vitamins, like she doesn't have fertility hormones, like added, like the likelihood of this is like 1%.
It gives very much like how my sex education in a southern conservative town goes with like it only takes once to get pregnant.
I know, but it's not true. It's just not true. Okay, let's get off this topic. So let's do a character spotlight really quickly. And I know last time we talked a lot about all of the characters, but I feel like there are a lot of characters in this that are important, but actually don't have as much character development as some of the others. So Julian, Nicholas, Logain, Ramil, Hafter, Utha, like I feel like they don't have enough character development for us to really talk about characteristics. So I'm just going to go through these and at the end, we can talk about anybody in depth. So Duncan, I feel like is pretty easygoing, resourceful. He's a strategic thinker and he's kind of mysterious. Merrick is depressed. Um, he is still very much motivated by emotional intelligence. He's still idealistic. At the bottom line, he is dutiful. Fiona, on the other hand, is very easily angered. She is a little bit judgmental. She's pragmatic and she's very resilient. Genevieve is bitter, violent, determined, and unyielding. Kel is perceptive, rational, disciplined, and also a strategic thinker. The architect is intellectual, curious, ambitious, and ruthless. And then Bregan is bitter, practical, ruthless, and stoic. So there are some similarities here, but I think we don't get as much of an in-depth look at any singular character as much as we did in the Stolen Throne.
Yeah, I think that without the regards of like Duncan, Merrick, and Fiona, all of the characters are very static characters. Like they do not change very much as they go about, which makes sense because, Duncan, Merrick, and Fiona are the main characters of the story. Like they're the ones who are really, the story is focused on them. So they go through the most character development. I liked Merrick a lot more in this book than I did in Stolen Throne. I just feel like he had, even though he's a little depressed, like he's still himself, but he has grown like so much in understanding like what he's feeling. The Merrick of the Stolen Throne who runs from his duty and has now grown into this king who faces insurmountable odds to keep a promise that he made. And I just really like that character development for him in this book.
I completely agree with that. Okay, so let's get into some analysis. The first thing I have to talk about is a lore inconsistency, which is the architect's background. I don't understand how he doesn't know anything. So we know that Corypheus was the high priest of Dumont, which suggests that the architect was the high priest of Arthemiel. How then does he have these major gaps in knowledge? Like he was a human, yet he doesn't know what a day or a mirror is. Wouldn't he remember this as from his time as a human in Tevinter ruling over the temple of Arthemiel?
Yeah, I think so. And it comes just like Uthemiel is it not he not like the god of beauty?
Yes.
So you think that like he would know what a mirror is, not like in a vain sense of way, but like there would just be a lot of like emphasis on beauty and all of that. And like the difference between like Corypheus is like so meaningful and knows so much and like even remembers his time in the Fade. Like he delivers one of the most greatest lines of the series. As you know, I've seen Throne of the Gods and it was empty. But the architect doesn't really see any of that. And I think that it comes down to this idea of the Tevinter Magisters really gets teased out in Corypheus, and it wasn't teased out enough when they were developing the architect. I think that explains the inconsistency.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think a major question, moving on a little bit, I think one of the central questions that this novel provokes is surrounding the sentience of the Darkspawn. I'm not sure that the narrative offers one singular answer, but I do think it presents us with the question of what makes a Darkspawn sentient or not. And I think it's very reminiscent of Mass Effect 3 with the question of does this unit have a soul?
I definitely agree with that. And I think that like with the Darkspawn, it comes to the question like, are they truly sentient? Or are they still just motivated by the call of the old gods? Like the architect claims that they can resist that call, but how do we really know that the architect's plan is not some deception of the old gods to like try to get this architect to find them and start a blight?
We absolutely don't know that. I think it's a very fair criticism, but I do think that this is a central claim of the architect. Like the architect wants the reader to believe that the Darkspawn are sentient, or at least that he is sentient, and that the Darkspawn can become sentient.
And I think it goes back, like when we first realize the architect's plan and when it's given out to is in chapter 8 with the dissonant quote from the Canticle of Silence, which I find interesting because Dumont is the god of like silence. I want to read it. The old gods will call to you. From their ancient prisons, they will sing. Dragons with wicked eyes and wicked hearts. On blackened wings does deceit take flight. the first of my children lost to the night. And I think it's interesting because this is very much like about the Magisters. There's a lot in this that you could interpret, especially when the Maker talking about like the Maker, the first of my children lost to the night, which indicates that they are spirits.
Yeah.
There's some kind of spirit magical connection to this. But it comes interesting to me because it comes to the point of like, I think this is chosen to say like either to point like, oh, the architect's trying to do this old god's call, or it's point there to say the Darkspawn are always motivated by the call of the old gods. So my question in this would be like, do the Darkspawn, are they sentient, or they are only as sentient as the call of the old gods will allow them to be?
I think that's a great question. And I don't even think there's anything else to say on it. So I'm going to move on to my next point, which is the nature of Fiona's character. So I get frustrated with this book because I feel like the book bends over backwards to compare Fiona to Catriel. And explicitly, like it even does so in the book. However, I find her so much more similar to either Logain or Rowan, both of them, than she is to Catriel. I mean, the temper, the suspicion, the intuition, all of these things are things she has in common with both Rowan and Logain. Catriel, she doesn't really exhibit any of those characteristics. So it leaves me asking, what does she even have in commonality with Catriel other than the fact that they're both elven women?
I don't think there is one, but I do think the comparison with Rowan is really interesting, which explains like why Merrick is so obsessed with keeping his promise to Fiona, because I think he does probably see a little bit of Rowan in there, and the fact that Merrick did break a promise to Rowan. Like, I know he married her and they had a child and she became queen and they did all of that, but he did like betray her trust. He betrayed her loyalty and broke a promise to her. And I think that's a lot of motivation in there. I do agree. I think that Fiona is much more similar to Logain or Rowan. And I think that's part of what attracts Merrick to Fiona. He's attracted to Catriel because Catriel is different from everyone around him and how she treats him differently than everyone else around him. I think older Merrick longs for the simplicity of his life in the rebellion, and Fiona reminds him of the simplicity of that.
Right. And also it's so interesting what you said, because he's drawn to Catriel because she's different than everyone he's ever known. He's drawn to Fiona because she's like his friends.
Mm-hmm.
It's significant. It's very significant. So the next thing I want to talk about is the role of prophecy within the novel. Both sides of the narrative are driven by prophecy. Genevieve has prophetic visions of her brother and is driven to rescue him, while the architect has visions that Bregan will come to him. And I think that this is really significant. It's a driving force of the novel that exists outside any decisions or things that the characters do.
And like even Merrick is driven by prophecy as well. Like he's
With
doing
Flemeth.
this because of Flemet's prophecy. It's this idea that like nothing you can do can circumvent the prophecy, or you're not going to undo the prophecy. You're not going to undo any of this. This is the lesson of like when you try to circumvent any of this, when you try to affect fate, it ends badly for you, which is the whole like lesson of the story of the Magisters. The whole lesson is that they try to tamper with nature. They try to tamper with reality and claim something that is not theirs, and it unleashes destruction upon the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into our ratings, I just have one more thing I want to bring up, and it's about Julian and Nicholas's relationship. So in the book, we are not really explicitly told that they are together romantically until the Fade Dream. To me, it makes me question why it was written this way. Maybe it's a relic of the time. I don't know. But I know that the author, David Gaider, he is a member of the LGBT community. So the writing of this pains me, because I feel like it very much fits into the bury your gays trope, where, you know, we're just going to kill off all the gay people and make them straight if we can. And I don't know, maybe he was edited, maybe he had to change it. I don't know. But you know, we barely even get a mention of their relationship until they're in the Fade. And then both of them, by the end of the novel, they die. It's frustrating to me that we have these queer characters who have to get killed off by the end of the novel. And so I even looked up the definition of the barrier gaze trope, which is a literary trope that has appeared in media across genres since the end of the 19th century. Works using the trope often feature a same-gender couple with one of the lovers dying and the other realizing they were never actually gay, often running into the arms of a heterosexual partner. So obviously this last part does not happen, but Julian does die, and the other Nicholas, he does sacrifice himself. So I think it fits in some ways, and in other ways it doesn't.
Yeah, I feel like it very much fits almost in the trope. I'm reminded of the scene in Little Women when when Joe is meeting with the editor and he's like, you have to get her married or dead, because the woman has to end up dead or married. And that's how writing has to go.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a really good comparison. So let's move on to our ratings for this book. As a reminder, I think my ratings were like a 3.6 or something like that, 3.7 maybe, for The Stolen Throne. So let's go through this time. Why don't you go first?
So for plot, I gave it a 3. I just think it's a basic plot. Maybe like a 3 point. I'll give a plot of 3.5 just because like the introduction of the Darkspawn is very different, but like we get similar beat patterns of a lot of stuff. Characters, I put the characters again at the 3. I feel like they're similar to The Stolen Throne. Pros, I put a 2 just because the shifting of perspectives in the way that it's done was distracting for me. Like it didn't work very well for me. I put dialogue as a 4. Again, I think David Gaider writes great dialogue. I'm interested in the conversations that are being had, especially the conversations between Fiona and Merrick, the conversations between Merrick and Duncan, the conversations between Fiona and Duncan. I really loved all of those. And then world building, I gave a 3 as well, for a grand total of a 15.5, which leads me to like a 3.1.
So, I gave the plot a 2 because I felt like it was really confusing, and boring. Like they're just traveling and they're fighting Darkspawn, and that's like the first 2/3 of the book. And I feel like there could have been more interesting things that happened. Like, what if they met another Legion of the Dead? What if, they had more time with the architect to be convinced? There's lots of things that could have happened. I don't know. So I gave it a 2. For characters, I also gave it a 3. I think that there is some pretty good character development, but I think that there could have been more. For the pros, I gave the pros a 2 because I completely agree with you. The biggest flaw of this book is the switching of perspective. It makes it really hard to follow. It makes it really hard to kind of figure out who's talking when. A lot of times authors, when they're switching between POVs, put a little symbol, something marking the shift. This doesn't happen. If it had that would be different. But this shifts POVs like in mid conversations. And to me, I don't like that. I agree with you that the dialogue is the strength of this novel. However, I did not feel that it was anywhere near as strong as the dialogue in The Stolen Throne. So I gave it a 3. And then I also gave the lore a 3 because while there are some new and interesting things surrounding the Darkspawn, the biggest lore inconsistency of the nature of the architect and his former life as a high priest of Erthemiel just raises too many questions for me to give it higher than a 3. So my total was a 13 for a total rating of 2.6.
Well, both of us decreased in our ratings.
Yeah, I think this is going to be the lowest score for me. It was a slog for me to get through this book. I didn't even finish this book until yesterday.
Right.
It was I don't like this story, and not because of I hate the characters or anything like that. I don't find the architect super compelling, and I hate Genevieve so much that I just hated reading her POVs. Yeah. So I didn't enjoy this book. I remember the first time I read it, I didn't hate it. I didn't love it. I probably rated it like a 3.5 or something. But this time around, I just liked it a lot less.
Yeah. And I think that I find it so funny because like Book Fiona, love Book Fiona, want to read more from Book Fiona. Game Fiona, could take her or leave her.
Yeah.
Game Architect, love him. Great villain. Really interesting. Really good voice acting. Like good all around. Book Architect.
Yeah. Very much agreed. Very much agreed. And same with Utha. Like in the book, I find her so much more interesting than she is in game. In game, she just kind of stands there.
Yeah, I totally agree about Utha in that. All right. Well, if you don't have anything else to add with that, we will wrap it up. Thank you for bringing the outline. This is an okay book. We had a lot of fun talking about it. Thank you all for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We will see you next time. Thanks for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. You can find us on Twitter at DA Lorecast.
If you have any lore questions, topics to unpack, or side character suggestions, join our Cups Podcasting and More Discord server. It's easily the best place on the internet. You can also support us financially through our Patreon. You can find us there on patreon.com/DragonAgeLorecast.
The Dragon Age Lorecast is part of the Robots Radio Network. For more information about the Robots Radio Network, join the Discord server via the link in our episode description.
If you enjoyed the show or learned something new today, please subscribe, leave us a review, and join the Patreon. And if you enjoyed our intro and outro music, give a big thank you to Pipeman Studios. Thank you, Pipeman. Thanks again for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We'll see you next time.
How well do you know your video game lovers?
Have you ever wondered how your video game bays stack up against all the other delectable digital dates?
I'm Genesis, the girl whose motto in life is love, laugh, tequila. And on Two Girls, One Ship, we analyze, rate, and review all that the world of video game romances has to offer.
And I'm Vervada, the hopeless romantic cat lady and lifelong gamer.
But you should know that our podcast centers on character and romance analysis and doesn't shy away from exploring the fun of physical connection.
Or from the deep emotional connections built between two characters, using specific in-game dialogue and the overall narrative journey. So join the Two Girls, One Ship shipsters, and remember,
beauty is in the eye of the controller.